So it's May 2nd, 2024, and we're going to talk a little bit about the student protests that have been the center of media attention over the last week or so. Yesterday, I was contacted by a Belgian reporter who was writing a story for a mainstream Belgian newspaper, and she had Googled experts on political polarization and found me and wanted to know my opinions about the student protests. And the first question she asked is this being caused by political polarization? Like, it was hard for the Belgians to understand all the turmoil on the campuses because, according to their understanding, Israel is an important ally of the United States, right? So why are they being vilified by these universities? And so I explained to her that what we were seeing in the campus protests was a kind of a window into the current state of the progressive postmodern worldview, and that the protests couldn't really be understood correctly without the larger cultural context of their expression. And so I explained that the student protests, in some ways, from a big picture, stem from the same causes, or one of the main causes of political polarization, but they're not being caused directly by it. In other words, I explained that a significant reason that the United States is polarized is over the last 60 years, a new worldview, a new significant cultural structure has emerged. It's matured over the decades and now represents a discrete form of culture which we can identify with the label the progressive postmodern worldview. And this worldview originally became democratized through protests in the 60s, and the spirit of dissatisfaction with the status quo has animated it from the beginning. And I explained to her that, at least from my perspective, this progressive postmodern worldview has brought many very important moral forms of progress to our culture, and that at their best, the students who are protesting aspire to represent the conscience of our civilization, right? In other words, war is a horrific condition in the world that deserves to be protested against, and we want to protest war wherever we see it. Human suffering is certainly another very legitimate focus of protest and dissent. And perhaps even in some cases disruption. Human suffering creates urgency, moral urgency and physical urgency. So I explained that the impulses for world-centric morality, which have in some ways been the leading light of progressive postmodernism from its beginning, right? Really we can see it beginning to emerge over a century ago, but it becomes, as I said, democratized in a major kind of public cultural structure in the 60s. And although some estimates have tried to kind of pigeonhole it into the far left, it represents 12%. I dispute that finding and think that realistically this progressive postmodern worldview, understood as a structure of agreements about what is good and true and beautiful, it's more like 20% of the United States in terms of the loose demographic identification. And more importantly, that more than just the numbers of 20%, this progressive postmodern worldview has come to define the cultural center of gravity for a significant portion of America's cultural elites. So we see, of course, the institutions, the culturally elite institutions, such as the media and universities and the arts, that as of now they've become in a sense dominated and even captured by the cultural sensibilities of this progressive postmodern worldview for both good and bad. Now, the part of the way that this progressive postmodern worldview, especially in the Anglophone world, but in some ways throughout the developed world in varying degrees, it has gained cultural power, although it still lacks political power. It's gained cultural power and the sympathy and allegiance of elites by identifying a form of transcendence, right? A form of deeper meaning that is sorely lacking within the mainstream of modernity, right? It's been called a meaning crisis. And so postmodernism finds meaning in those who've been victimized, marginalized, those who are oppressed, those for whom the emergence of modernity over the last 300 years have pushed aside or otherwise discounted or wronged. And so righting the wrongs of history, I'd say, again, it's an important task for our culture to get to a point where we can respect ourselves again. And so to the extent that the protests in particular and progressive postmodernism in general is motivated by this world-centric morality, it's a beautiful thing. Okay, but over the decades, so we had this spurt in the 60s, and many of the young people who were attracted to this worldview in the 60s matured and became professors and leaders of the institutions. And so this kind of hunger for transcendence, which is at least partially satisfied by this embrace of a world-centric morality, is an important sense of not only what's driving the protesters, but also why universities have tried to be as tolerant of it as possible. And while the media, American media, is paying a significant amount of attention. I mean, this is only probably several thousand people involved in these protests. So in the scheme of things, it's pretty small. And if there were other causes that were being protested with these numbers, they wouldn't make the nightly news. But because the mainstream media, this in some ways represents their estimates of transcendence, they want to make it front and center. So it's a legitimate story. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the protesters' impact on American culture in this moment is purely manufactured by the wants of the media, but clearly they're amplifying the voices as a result of their own sympathy, right, for both good and bad. The rub, if you will, or the limitations of the protests and the downside of them, despite these noble intentions, is that especially over the last 10 years, as progressive postmodernism has tried to rally people around the basic propositions of transcendence that it stands for, it's had mixed success. Right, so we had the Me Too movement that had a spurt of transcendence. We've certainly had environmental activism and concern about global warming. Greta Thunberg. I mean, she managed to generate a sense of transcendence within progressive postmodernism. But ultimately, one of the difficult tasks that we know from cultural evolution is the more evolved culture is, the less span. Right? In other words, there's more depth, less span is one of the basic principles of evolutionary development. And so postmodernists have found it very difficult to rally large numbers of people to their cause. Like, for example, with climate change, despite the nobility of saving the environment and keeping humanity from devastating the planet through global warming. It's been very difficult for them, for the left, for progressive postmodernism, to gain political will around climate change, right? And others, Me Too kind of faded out, right? It's hard to sustain these propositions of transcendence. But one of where they have tapped into a gusher of unifying, motivating, transcendent energy is, at least in 2020, we saw with the case of George Floyd and the evident effect of police brutality and racism in the United States. Right, so we had this kind of upheaval in 2020 where progressive postmodernism frames it as the racial reckoning. And I think some good things have come out of that and some bad things have come out of that. Obviously, there was the pressure cooker of the pandemic. There was 4 years of the Trump administration. So the conflagration of riots and other upheavals that occurred in the summer of 2020 did manage to have an impact on the institutions of American society, as we see with the success of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Although whether that can succeed long term, whether it can survive the backlash against it, which is now occurring, is yet to be seen. But regarding the student protests, they found they found this kind of motivating political energy around it, partially because the cause of the Palestinians is intersectional. In other words, there's lots of propositions of transcendence or ideals within progressive postmodernism for whom the cause of the Palestinians, it's a sweet spot. Because it not only is a group of people who are suffering and a war that's being perpetrated, but it's also the perpetrators are seen as the United States and its client state, right? So we hold ourselves, of course, to a greater sense of morality than we can hold other people. So the Uyghurs, who are arguably far more innocent in their suffering than the Palestinians, have not been the subject of progressive postmodern concern. It doesn't push the buttons of political outrage for beyond passing concern within progressive postmodernism, for a variety of reasons. And one of them is that one of the binding elements of progressive postmodernism is that they're trying to transcend modernity. They're not just trying to transcend modernity's pathologies. They're trying to transcend modernist culture altogether, right? Modernist culture is sort of the villain, the oppressor, the polluter, the enemy of progressive postmodernism, and the kind of the villain around which many of their initiatives are organized for both good and bad, right? I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, we can see how modernity is necessary. That this a culture of liberty and prosperity is a prerequisite to progressive concerns and progressive culture in general. But that's another, it's another talk. What I can say with regard to the protesters is that part of the reason that the Palestinian cause is a sweet spot is that it triggers a sense of loyalty to what perhaps is best described as reverse patriotism, right? So there's anti-modernism is a motivating kind of underlying value for progressive postmodernism, and that this anti-modernism manifests itself as a kind of an aversion to the United States, which is in some ways the greatest modernist nation and the kind of the leading proponent of modernity throughout history. So naturally, this sense this sense of reverse patriotism has kind of two ends to it. On the one end, we have this world-centric morality, wherein a sense of being a global citizen, a sense that everybody counts and that Americans are not more morally valuable than people in other countries, and that we want to transcend nationalism and all of the evil that it's and the mischief that it's created in the world. So world-centric morality naturally goes with a sense of globalism, and thus an aversion to nationalism, and hence an aversion to patriotism. But there's another end to it too. Besides the noble world-centric, we also have the ethnocentric. And increasingly over the last 10 years, as progressive postmodernism kind of collectively as a culture, right? I mean, it probably is occurring at an unconscious level. But within progressive postmodernism, this part of the way they've been able to tap into the power of for example, the racial upheaval of 2020, was that they've combined this noble world-centric morality, which gives them the moral high ground in many important ways, with a kind of an ethnocentric us versus them. Let's find a new group that we can hate. The us versus them involves, white people and everybody else. So that kind of undercurrent of progressive postmodernism, which is a revision of racism against white people, which is evident in DEI. I mean, there's all kinds of euphemisms. But again, part of the backlash is to identify how racist many of the at least ethnocentric tropes within progressive postmodern culture are. So in the case of the Palestinians, of course, where they're making common cause with the Palestinians, and the Palestinian people, especially in Gaza, are very much led and loyal to Hamas. And, Hamas is in some ways indistinguishable from the Islamic State in terms of their their motivation, their tactics, their obstinance, their militancy, their unwillingness to surrender, their religious motivation. It's hard to distinguish between ISIS, which the world unequivocally condemns, and Hamas, which has now been embraced, as a sort of innocent party by, at least that's the impression that many of these protesters give. And so, although they have it's much easier to motivate people at an ethnocentric level because it taps into evolutionary psychology, right? In other words, that us versus them, let's, circle the wagons in our group and get solidarity because there's this common enemy. That's thousands of years old. And so it's much easier to trigger that kind of solidarity than it is the more ephemeral and abstract idea of world-centric morality. And so, in a sense, because the rest of the United States sees these protesters and sees them championing Hamas, and in a sense, despite many of their best efforts, this kind of tone of anti-Semitism has been introduced and is evident in, among the ethnocentric elements, right? So we have world-centric elements, ethnocentric elements, we have mixed. But the world-centric elements, because they're making common cause and because they have this oppressed, frame, they are their ability to purge the ethnocentric elements within their midst is basically, they have no ability to do that, right? They don't have the moral resources to be able to say, hey, we're here because everybody counts, and we're not going to be dragged down into this kind of ethnocentric hatred. But nevertheless, the dilemma is that it's that very ethnocentric hatred that gives them the juice, right, which they are using to create an international stir, right? So again, it's not all bad, it's complex. But the irony is, at least in my opinion, that when we look at the Palestinians and say, look, these are suffering people, clearly they're being wiped out by this war. They're caught between the anger of Israel and the fact that they're, in a sense, hostages of Hamas, right? The Palestinian people in Gaza are being used by Hamas as a tool of their own political ends. And the more people that die and the more people suffer, the more those nefarious political ends are served. In the United States, this dilemma of the Palestinian cause, and the irony, as I mentioned, is that the way for the Palestinians to become thoroughly liberated in a permanent way that can escape the craziness of Israeli-Palestinian politics and the larger context of the battle between modernity and Islamism is to pursue a strategy like Gandhi pursued in the liberation of India, or like MLK pursued in the first generation of the civil rights movement in the 60s. That was a pure, both of those, both Gandhi and Martin Luther King, both expressed this world-centric morality and the political tactics. And we could also mention Nelson Mandela. The political it's a well-developed strategy of moral high ground, but it's got to be purged of ethnocentrism, and it has to be thoroughly committed to nonviolence. And this world-centric morality needs to shine through so that you're not only caring about the Palestinians, you're caring about the Israelis too, right? They're in some ways victims of this as well. And so from a world-centric perspective, everybody really does count, including both sides in this war. And if they could find a leader or otherwise create a movement within the Palestinian cause that was guided by the principles of Gandhi and Mandela and King, then they would be an unstoppable force. However, with Hamas in the picture, there's no way that they're going to be able to reach this powerful position of world-centric nobility from which their real power would stem. That power is completely sabotaged at every turn by the presence of these horrific, hateful, ethnocentric elements that represent a much earlier time in history. So the idea is that if the leaders of progressive postmodernism in the United States were to be able to understand from a developmental perspective the odd political bedfellows of ethnocentrism and world-centrism, and find a way to purge the ethnocentrism and embrace the worldcentrism more thoroughly, they'd find that they had the political power to garner worldwide sympathy in a way that would really change things. But in their current situation, short of doing that, they're basically part of the problem. And the biggest problem of all is that these protests and this upheaval that's going on right now is an ongoing campaign commercial for Donald Trump's candidacy. In other words, in the moment of passion, right, they may want purity. They may want to reject modernity and reject Joe Biden and reject the Democratic Party. But obviously, if Trump is elected, that's not going to redound to their political interests. That level of strategic, calculation is not really what this is about, I understand. It's a cry from the heart. But still, if this cry from the heart results in Trumpist populism, then that's something that progressive postmodernists need to own. They need to take responsibility for that. I mean, in the larger scope of history, we can see how the rise of progressive postmodernism indeed has polarized the American society and led to Trump. Almost every word that comes out of Trump's mouth is a sort of a statement of antithesis to progressive postmodernism, right? He is the candidate who the base of America is poised to elect as their cultural bodyguard, because they feel this rejection and this vilification by progressive postmodernism. Now, all of this is evolutionarily appropriate in some ways. All of this is somewhat inevitable, and I believe it will lead to the good. Progressive postmodernism is discovering the limits of its own cultural antithesis through these protests. And that the fact that Green's militancy will result in Trump, that again, going back to more death, less span, those who support Republican populism, Trumpist populism, that's a big base, right? Not just Trump's base, but the currently 51% of Americans who are ready to vote for Trump, despite his horrific characteristics. So understanding the larger upheaval of the postmodernists with the Palestinian cause, why they have circled around the Palestinians as the new George Floyd, and how this will lead to the backlash on many levels that we're experiencing now, and how that very problem is in a sense highly stimulative for what we ultimately need to do to overcome the whole thing, to overcome the negative aspects of progressive postmodernism and the negative aspects of Trumpism, and that is to grow as a civilization and begin to build this next synthetic worldview that is emerging now beyond the progressive postmodern worldview. I mean, in the same way that progressive postmodernism has emerged over the last 60 years, it's not the end of history. Something comes next. And what comes next is the ability to find a kind of a synthesis that can take the best and leave the worst of all of these various cultural structures.